Guys, I am Daniel Carter and welcome to my first video on YouTube. I figured, I'm such a huge advocate for social justice and social issues, and I always have a lot to say on a lot of different things. So why not, start a YouTube channel and post, just videos on my thoughts. Many of my videos are going to be centered probably on Black Lives Matter, most of them. So I figured my first video be a video on explaining what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. This movement of Black Lives Matter is a really powerful movement, and it speaks to me. And so, because I am a young African American male, and I really understand what we've seen in our country with young African American men and women dying at the hands of law enforcement officers. I'm going to break the video up into two parts. So this is going to be the first part of the conversation. Have to be informed. A lot of people just go to their favorite news website or their news channel or their news outlet, and they read, and that's all they get. And those certain news outlets can be very conservative, they can be very liberal, or they can be something else. Or we don't know. But that, if anything, that's all you know about the Black Lives Matter movement. You don't really have an informed opinion on what Black Lives Matter is all about. You have to be engaged as well when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. It's very easy for us to, push back and say, I don't want to be involved, or, it's not someone that I know. It's not someone that I'm related to. It's not someone that I associate with, so I'm going to push back from the table and not worry about it. But no, we have to be engaged. We got to have a lot of understandings to understand the real cry behind Black Lives Matter. And we've also got to understand the historical context. What leads to this movement, what leads to something such as Black Lives Matter. So we got to understand the platform, we got to understand the organization. What is it all about? We've got to understand some common objectives when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and how to respond to those objectives. Focus on the black-white dynamics. Why? Because it's called Black Lives Matter. And the history of race relations in this country usually have to do with black and whites. Not saying that these dynamics play out in all sorts of roles. We got gender, male and female. We got economics, rich and poor. So that does not mean that others are not important. It's just that we're talking about Black Lives Matter. If you don't understand the history and that actions in the past, then we will never make progress, and we will never understand Black Lives Matter or race relations in our country altogether. There are hundreds of years of history we have in this country as African Americans. I don't have time. I literally don't have time to tell you all of that history. So I'm going to jump over a few things. I'm going to focus mainly on the policing aspect and the criminal justice part of our history, because this is where the grief really comes from for Black Lives Matter, and it all plays into each other. We've all seen or read or heard this from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As we know, all did not mean everyone back then. This was 1776. I also have some quotes from the Virginia General Assembly, which was one of the first forms of representative government in our country. Be it therefore enacted that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to their mother, to the condition of their mother. This was in December of 1662. In other words, you could be born free or you could be born a slave. This was December 1662, over 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. Also from the Virginia General Assembly, it shall not be lawful for any Negro or other slave to carry or arm himself with any club, staff, gun, sword, or any other weapon of defense or offense, nor go or depart from his master's ground without a certificate from his master, mistress, or overseer. Now, from the very beginning, black people could not show any form of independence. They could not arm themselves at all. Not only that, but their freedom, was restricted. You had to go and ask your master, your mistress, or your overseer for permission to leave the plantation. Also from the Virginia General Assembly, all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate. 1705. So from the beginning, Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians were not equal at all, but property, real estate. Now, let's fast forward. You've got slavery. I don't care what anybody tells you, that war was fought over slavery. The war between the North and the South, the Civil War, was fought over slavery. Now, after Emancipation Proclamation, what happens? Slavery's free, slavery's abolished. We should be good from here on out, right? While I was doing my research, I was preparing for this presentation, I came across an article by One Continuous Graveyard of Emancipation and the Birth of the Professional Police Force by a historian named Carrie Lee Merritt. And in the article, she expresses, that the organized police force in America and its foundation was about control and authority, particularly over black people. Following emancipation, the number of people in the Deep South rose significantly as the substance and enforcement of certain laws changed considerably. In stark contrast to the antebellum period, the vast majority of those now arrested were black. To keep up with the rapid pace of arrests, cities and towns that did not have police forces before the Civil War quickly established professional uniformed forces during early Reconstruction. Before the Civil War, law and order was mostly concerned with poor whites. And it was how to keep them from killing each other, because back then the way they settled disagreements or feuds was over literally knife fights or gun fights. And so after the Civil War, there are millions of slaves that are free. What are you going to do with all these free slaves? How are you going to keep them from rising up? Now you have to pay people to pick your cotton. Oh my God. So the article goes on to say, no longer slave masters, former slaveholders use institutionalized ways to reassert their power. Just as poor whites had been singled out for prosecution for nonviolent behavioral crimes in the antebellum period, so too were blacks in the postbellum period. And as one Union soldier stationed in Meridian, Mississippi wrote of the former slaveholders, it is their hope and intention under the guise of vagrant laws, etc., to restore all of slavery but its name. Man. So the Emancipation Proclamation made it illegal. You can't own slaves anymore. But that doesn't mean that it eliminated racism. And it doesn't mean that this social class and this ranking was gone away with at all. It just means that they had to find ways around that law called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, there are a couple ways they found around that law. Number one was about power. How are you going to keep them from rising up? How are you going to keep them from, doing their own thing, basically, by scaring them, by terrorizing them? That's how you're going to do it. So there's legal means and there's extra legal means to keep power. So I want to read something else to you guys. It's very graphic. So if you want to skip over the next 60 seconds or so, go ahead. But as I said earlier, if we don't understand the history behind Black Lives Matter, we will never understand the race relations in our country at all. So I'm going to read it. So under Republican rule in the South, the main victims were young black men who appeared to challenge the racial boundary that had seemed impossible a year before. In 1904, a black sharecropper named Luther Hobart was suspected of murdering a white plantation owner near the Sunflower County town of Doddsville. Hobart tried to escape with his wife, but the two were captured by a posse and tied to a tree. More than 1,000 spectators were on hand, eating hard-boiled eggs, sipping lemonade, and drinking whiskey. As the Hobarts were being subjected to torture before being burned alive, they were forced to hold off their hands while one finger at a time was chopped off and distributed as souvenirs. Their ears were cut off. Hobart was beaten severely and one of his eyes knocked out with a stick, hung by a shred from the socket. The most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew. This instrument was bored into the legs and arms and bodies of these two, man and woman, and it tore out big pieces of flesh, raw flesh. This is not fiction. This is historical fact. Black Lives Matter means not only does the people of our country, been devalued, but it means that devaluation was made into a spectacle. Like going to a theater. They would set up chairs and for the women and the children that wanted to sit, they could come to the front. It was like a big festival. And the show was a lynching. Black Lives Matter. extra-legal means, and then there were non-extra-legal means, which were means that were signed into law. Now, one of those laws was the Vagrancy Act. Now, we remember I read you the Virginia General Assembly a few minutes ago, which said that you can't leave the plantation without permission. Well, what do you do after emancipation? Nobody's allowed to leave the plantation. Nobody's allowed on the plantation, I'm sorry. Okay, so here's what you do. You make a law that says if you're black and you don't have a piece of paper that says you're employed by an upstanding white person, then you are fined $50. What slave have you heard of that has $50? So if you didn't have the $50 to pay that fine, a white person could say, no, hey, I got you, let me pay the $50, and then you come work for me. Now, on to the Civil Rights Movement. I just want to talk a little bit about a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. Many of you may have heard of her. Fannie Lou Hamer was a powerhouse in the 50s and 60s within the Civil Rights Movement. And I love how she combined her faith and her love for justice to work on behalf of the Civil Rights Movement for herself and for others. Even though she was fired from her job, sharecropping job, where she worked, for 18 years. Even though the room where she stayed at after that, got shot at, and even though she almost starved to death the winter after that, she goes on to speak at the Democratic National Convention that I got the opportunity to go to a few months ago. The whole world is watching. She goes to the Democratic National Convention, and she went from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and they were trying to unseat all the white Democratic, coalition that was there. They wanted African Americans to have a voice, basically. So she's sitting in front of all these senators and representatives, and she gives her testimony, which is so powerful, about being taken prisoner for her actions on behalf of voting rights. And she was beaten in a prison cell, not by the police officers, but by the other black inmates who were forced to beat her by the police officers. It's so important for you guys to hear what she had to say at the Democratic National Convention. It was so powerful. So here, take a look.
On the 10th of September 1962, 16 bullets were fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. That same night, 2 girls were shot in Rooseville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. And June the 9th, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop, was returning back to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailway bus. When we got to Winona, Mississippi, which is Montgomery County, 4 of the people got off to use the washroom, and 2 of the people to use the restaurant. 2 of the people wanted to use the washroom. The 4 people that had gone in to use the restaurant was ordered out. During this time, I was on the bus. But when I looked through the window and saw they had rushed out, I got off of the bus to see what had happened. And one of the ladies said it was a state highway patrolman and a chief of police ordered us out. I got back on the bus, and one of the persons who had used the washroom got back on the bus too. As soon as I was seated on the bus, I saw when they began to get the 5 people in a highway patrolman's car. I stepped off of the bus to see what was happening, and somebody screamed from the car that the fire workers was in and said, "Get that one there." And when I went to get in the car, when the man told me I was under arrest, he kicked me. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Vesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So, "Well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman. And he asked me where I was from. And I told him Roosevelt. He said, we're going to check this. And they left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, you were from Roosevelt, all right, and he used the curse word. And he said, we're going to make you wish you was dead. I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
If you like the video, spread it to your friends and your family and your, whoever on social media. So, because I feel like once we have a critical conversation on what Black Lives Matter is, then we can move forward on race relations in our country. So I'm gonna upload a second video later. So if you guys like this video, please let me know, leave a like on the bottom and subscribe to my page.